Are you ready to scale? Why not invest 3 minutes in our Scalability Index? It's quick, it's easy, and it's got specific guidance. Find it at evokinggenius.com/scale. Hello and welcome again to Genius at Scale. Today we have the co-founders of YouMakr, Abbas and Rami. Gentlemen, introduce yourself. Tell us a little about your company.
So YouMakr, at its core, is a website which helps students with their upcoming exams. And we leverage upon artificial intelligence to do so. So we've been around actually since, bloody hell. We've been around since 2017. So this is year 6 of the business. So Rami and I are seasoned veterans, I would say. It's been a wild ride. And here we are, 100,000 users later. We just finished our pre-seed round. And very excited as to the journey ahead, God willing.
So how did you get, it's interesting, I know your history a little bit. How did you get 6 years in? How did you find yourself in the tutoring space? Because you didn't start there, as I understand.
I don't know how we ended up in this space, honestly. It's a mystery to me. It's basically, so how can I explain it? In a nutshell, so Rami and I, we've known each other for years. I mean, he and I go way back, and we always wanted to do a business together. And then basically, I was like kind of angel investing, and he came up with a brilliant idea. And it was basically an inventions platform. It was basically a website that connected inventors with experts like electrical engineers and mechanical engineers and 3D printing experts. And the thinking behind YouMakr 1.0 was that we could democratize kind of like inventions. We could facilitate a better way in which to get inventions off the ground in a cheaper and a quicker way. Because Rami himself is an inventor, and he went through hell getting his invention off the ground. And so we launched kind of YouMakr as a means by which to kind of like help the invention process. And we incorporated in 2017. I think we started tinkering and probably launched in 2018. We did one round of funding in 2019, and then we miserably failed in 2019 and 2020. And we were just experimenting and just banging our head against the wall and getting no traction and just testing. And throughout the whole process, we were just asking like whichever user we could get, like, what do you want? How can we help you? What problem do you have, and how can we solve it? In that kind of like desperate search for like product market fit. And that's what Rami's been kind of like hammering into me from like day one. He's like, forget all the noise, just speak to the users and we'll give them what they want. And then what ended up happening, rather inadvertently, we ended up attracting a lot of final year engineering students from like South Asia, from like Pakistan and India. And they were coming onto YouMakr saying, look, we're okay with the kind of mechanics and inventions, but we are absolutely struggling with writing. And then Rami, being the genius that he is, he was like, interesting. And so he was like, maybe we can help them with their writing. And he kind of thought maybe we can get like experts and tutors onto the platform. And then he kind of like started experimenting with like artificial intelligence. This is like years ago, way before like ChatGPT. We built like, when I say we, he built this algorithm. I was just there in the background, just kind of giving him a thumbs up. So rooting him on.
I want to interrupt just for a sec. So what I'm catching here then is, Rami, you're the brains and Abbas he's the brawn. He's the muscle in the organization.
Beauty. I'm the beauty, and he's the brains behind all this.
Got it. I want to make sure I had that.
I'm not sure about the beauty part. Okay. I think the beauty part should be my column too.
I was wondering if he was the brawn, how did you guys get there too? But okay, you're worried about the beauty, I'm worried about the brawn. Okay, good. Just checking.
The history of YouMakr, I'd like to describe it like, the game of telephones?
Yeah.
Telephone game, yeah. It's like you whisper into the ear of someone, and then you whisper into the ear of someone, and then by the time you get to the next person, it's something completely different from where it started, how that sentence started. It's essentially YouMakr. We started with a concept, came out the other end with something completely different. We wouldn't, in our wildest imagination, imagine that we would end up doing what we're doing today. So, no, it's been quite a journey.
So it's interesting. I want to dig into the product a little bit because there is this concern, or it's a new conversation about artificial intelligence essentially equaling copying or doing the work for the students. But you're not doing that. You're just preparing them better than they could do without your product.
I think the way in which we look at it is akin to this. Like when we first started with YouMakr, when Rami kind of got the idea of this new algorithm, and we launched it and we had immediate success. And then we started speaking to other stakeholders, not necessarily users, but we went to like some investors. And back then, this would be around 2021, kind of 2022. That's the type of question mark we got. Like, what about the underlying ethics of this? Is this cheating? You're taking out the kind of work and the underlying effort from the academic process. And there was a tremendous level of pushback. I would argue, or even go so far as to say there was a lot of criticism of YouMakr back then. But I think Rami and I, we stood fast. We knew that this technology had a lot of traction and a lot of viability, and we imagined a world where AI would integrate itself not just within the classroom, but within the workspace, even within the home. And I think at the tail end of 2022, ChatGPT was released, and suddenly all of the critique and the pushbacks that we were getting, specifics to the underlying ethics, just diluted overnight. Nobody cared then, because I think then the penny dropped and people realized that actually this type of technology is going to be ubiquitous with academia. And so I think that's point number one. Point number two is that if you look at the kind of history of like technology, so, imagine when, for example, the calculator came out, there was a lot of pushback then, and then suddenly the calculator became the standard practice within the classroom. Back in the day, like Rami and I, we went to school, and I would argue, John, perhaps, you went to school like in an era pre-internet. You'd get a reading list, you'd go to the library, you'd get the books, you'd start reading, and then for different assignments, you'd build accordingly. And then the internet happened, and again, a lot of pushback on the technology and it diluting the learning process. And I think the same happened with AI, and then eventually it will just become, as I say, the standard practice within the classroom. So we very much see it further integrating itself into the learning system.
It's interesting that the idea that it's cheating or diluting the educational process. Is it fair to say that it actually improves curiosity? Almost like the internet did, because now you could explore something where you go, I'm never going to even find this stuff in the library, but if I Google something and it gives me 50 search things coming back, I might explore something that I would have otherwise never seen. I could have never done that in a library world or a pre-internet world. Is it fair to say that you're in the preparing or the tutoring of the students, that they're actually getting a better education because it's more thorough as opposed to minimum standard? If I'm struggling in math, the tendency is to say, how little can I do because I don't like it, I don't understand it, and it's difficult. I try to get by. Is it fair to say that you actually give a more robust experience because you're leading them to areas that they wouldn't otherwise go?
So you hit the nail on the head there, John, because further to the calculator example that Abbas touched on, when calculators, these little handheld calculators, were made available to everybody back in the 70s, at that time you had school teachers on the streets carrying signs protesting that the calculator is dumbing down our kids. But as that concept became standard, what teachers realized is those kids are now able to do far more advanced mathematics. They're able to handle problems and think about solutions rather than being caught up with the mental arithmetic, which they should learn, But they're now exercising logical thinking alongside the calculator that enables them to solve far more complex problems.
Right.
And this is what's happening with AI now. Yes, it may speed up the writing element of things, but actually the brainstorming element, the back and forth interaction with the AI that can spark new ideas that you otherwise would never have thought of, that's progress. That gets the student to evolve in ways that they couldn't evolve before.
Yeah. I've got 7 kids, and all of them had to do science projects. That was a rite of passage. Is every year through about grade 8, you had to do a science project. And a grade 2 or a second grade kid they'd cut the celery and put it in 2 different colors of food coloring and show how it goes. But they got to the point where they wanted to do science, and I couldn't help them at all. They'd say, "Can you help me with my science project?" There was no way I could help them. I didn't have the capacity. It wasn't the capacity. I didn't have the capability to help them with the theory they were working on. This is the sort of thing that could not replace, but could augment a parent who doesn't have that kind of capacity?
I'm going through it myself now. So my daughter is doing GCSE, which is the equivalent of, I don't know what it's equivalent to in the US, but it's a standardized exam that they have to go through. And she was asking me about chemistry. I'm really bad with chemistry. I mean, I consider myself a scientist. That's my background, but not chemistry. That's like the worst subject. And she was asking me about different molecules and stuff, and I just couldn't answer her. Guess what? I pulled up an AI tutor, put the question in there, jogged my memory a little bit, and took all the credit.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. So obviously you're early in your scaling journey. How do you now measure scale? Because I imagine that may have changed from where you started in 2017. How do you capture or measure scale or count it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question because it's entirely arbitrary. It's entirely, subjective. And I don't think there are specific yardsticks dependent upon, for example, the industry or the underlying technology. I would argue that one measure that Rami and I take into consideration is what we perceive to be the underlying quote unquote metrics that we think venture capitalists would require. And so in terms of that particular journey, we look at what we think VCs will look for at our next round of funding, and then we see where we are on that journey, on that trajectory. And that's one way of, I think, measuring that kind of progress and that scaling. I think over and above that, it's just, I think, the number of users and just the reach that we're getting with the technology, and I think that also provides us with a measurement as to how big the company is getting.
And this is a freemium and then paid subscription model, or still free to everyone?
So we started as a freemium model, and as we did all the pivots, we're moving more towards a free trial kind of model, where you use it for a certain period of time and then obviously get to paid. But can I just circle back to your question about scale and how we define it? For me personally, I think a way to measure scale is when you reach a point to where you can amplify your output significantly without additional resources, or not adding resources at the same rate, where you can scale much quicker than the resources you have to put behind it. The way I would consider what a scalable business is, I mean, we all have ideas as to how a business can be scalable. If I think of a tech company versus a barber shop, you'd agree with me that a tech company is more scalable. But why is that? Well, the reason for that is because it's not because it's impossible to scale a barbershop business. Theoretically, it is possible. You can set up franchises, you can roll it out across the country, but it requires so much resources and it's incredibly difficult to do. Theoretically, it's possible, but it's not inherent in the business model that it scales easily. Whereas a scalable business is one that actually scales inherently without you having to continuously pushing it and putting more resources to get it to snowball.
Right. It makes a lot of sense. And I would imagine that, I ask, is your growth organic, or is it a combination, which is more effective, paid ads or marketing spend or word of mouth?
We actually achieved 100,000 users without spending a single penny on marketing so far. And that's great. Mainly based on delighting the customer to the point that they go, holy crap, I need to share this with all my student friends because they're going to love this. And that's really the foundation for our marketing plan, is to delight them with something that they've never seen before. Once they click that write more button, or they click that generate button, or having a question around an exam and they answer it correctly, or a tutor gives them some piece of insight, it's an adrenaline rush and they just get hooked into it. And that's the effect we're trying to capture, which then lends to that virality.
So the podcast is all about the entrepreneur's journey and the scaling journey. It's great when people get to the top of the mountain, and you guys are on your way up the mountain, which is good. You started in 2017. Obviously, it's been a little bit of a bumpy road to get to where you're at now. What's the biggest pitfall, roadblock, pothole that you've hit, and what did you learn from it? Like, how did it help you where you are today, even at the time when it looked like, oh, this is a disaster?
Wow, that's a good question. Given our different roles, I imagine like Rami's, I think, biggest lesson and his biggest roadblock is going to be much different to mine. I think as head of fundraising and as someone tasked to kind of get the money in, ultimately, I mean, that's the biggest reason why businesses, or at least tech startups, run into difficulty. It's because they just run out of money. And so, I promised Rami from the outset when we started this, I was like, you don't have to worry about the money. I'll get the money. Somehow, some way, I'll, I came about this close to handing out sexual favors. I mean, put it that way. That's how committed I was to the process.
Yeah. How did that work, though? You found that was a bad strategy?
Well, handing out I didn't actually. No. Basically, I think look, when in 2021, credit was cheap, liquidity was plentiful, confidence was high, and you could raise very quickly. Whereas in 2022, the market changed, and there was revaluations, there was a lot of tech layoffs, confidence starting to wane, and VCs started to change their approach. And as a general rule, and I think that's continuing now into 2023, the investment process with a high net worth, an angel consortium, a VC, in my experience, takes twice as long, and simultaneously results in half as much money relative to.
In my experience, twice as much effort and half
as much payoff. Exactly. Yeah. And so that for me was probably the biggest challenge. And what was the learning process, I think, from that? I think there's a number of lessons. The first is I'd leverage off the words of Mark Andreessen. Mark Andreessen said in a very famous interview that when you're learning about startups, theoretically, and when you're actually doing it, you kind of anticipate the product, the market, the team, and all that good stuff that they teach you. But what nobody prepares you for is the emotional roller coaster you go on as a startup founder. It is you get pulled in a million different directions, and most of the time you're in a dark place without a map, trying to find your way. You're lost at sea without a lighthouse in sight. And I think one of the lessons I'm starting to learn is just to try and keep an even keel, some semblance of like temperament, that when it's good, like right now, we've just finished the round, we're getting all this press, there's a lot of traction, a lot of buzz around YouMakr, to not get too carried away and just to kind of keep your feet on the ground. And simultaneously, and the market's tough, and you have to kind of keep grinding away. Again, it's not the end of the world. Don't get too despondent, don't get too down, but try and maintain a sense of temperament and enthusiasm simultaneously. And that's ultimately the process. Because if you get taken on those emotional swings, you'll lose yourself, I think, in the journey. And that's been, I've learned that the hard way. But I think that's one lesson to just, when it's bad, it's not as bad as you think it is. And when it's great, it's not as great as you think it is. So I think that's certainly one lesson. I think second lesson is that we live in a world, John, where there's such huge high levels of like expectation. There's and from VCs and from other investors, from your suppliers, and from your customers, maybe to some extent even from your employees, and the number of stakeholders that are looking at you and your business, wanting you to progress. And there may be a tendency, and I think I've suffered from this, to kind of like rush and just push and sometimes force it a little bit. But sometimes, and there's a very famous Chinese proverb which says sometimes when there's no clear option, the best thing to do is maybe to do nothing. And actually, there's this kind of impatience around a startup. But sometimes you can just, take the foot off the gas, and it's not the end of the world. And I think that's also a lesson that I've learned. And for any founders that's watching this podcast, I would advocate for that, to sometimes just take a little bit of a breath, and sometimes it'll work itself out.
Who's the toughest stakeholders? Because I work with founders and CEOs, and by my count, you have 6 or 7, depending on how you count. Who's the toughest?
I think, Rami will speak to this as well. I think we live in a world where you are able to overcome the funding obstacle. I think if you go through the process and you remain committed, there's a way in which to do so. And you may not kind of roar over the finish line, but I think the investment landscape, whilst challenging, is achievable, so to speak. I think getting the right employees, these are other stakeholders which are also quite demanding. I think if you can find them, go through a good interview process, get them into an environment where they can showcase their potential and, God willing, even exceed it. I think that's an achievable milestone as well. Demanding, but achievable. But the hardest is giving the consumer a product or a service which ultimately benefits them and solves their problem. And that is, you have to be meticulous and absolutely dogged, because you have to distance yourself from your opinion, from the market, from like other people's opinion, and you have to go straight to the user and ask them, what is your problem and how can I solve it? And you have to be religious in that process.
It may not be the problem that you want to solve, but it's the problem that they have.
100%. And I think the user is ultimately the most demanding stakeholder, and is oftentimes the quietest.
That's interesting. So that's difficult to read then.
Oh, very much so. Like if you're speaking to an investor, they can be quite vocal, and they're not shy in telling you their opinion, and nor should they, because ultimately it's their money. And we're tasked with a very privileged position on returning on that money. But sometimes extracting feedback from the user, because oftentimes the answer is okay, and you have to scratch beneath the surface, dig a little bit deeper, and go down that kind of rabbit hole. And so you have to do that because they're not going to give it to you. That you have to go through that kind of introspection process with them, and then something reveals itself, like this underlying issue, and from there you have your truth, and from there you have your product.
I've learned from the many users that I've interviewed and spoken to about their problems is never take the solution they propose. Listen to their problem, but not the solution. I remember it was Henry Ford. They asked him, he was saying, if I listened to my customer's solution, they would say, get me a faster horse. He knew their problem. He knew their problem. He knew the problem is they're not getting there fast enough, but he wouldn't take the solution. He came up with his own innovative solution. And I think that's one thing that I've learned over time is I should only listen to the problem from the user, but then the solution, I have to come up with something. That's my job. I have to come up with a solution that they have never thought of and then delight them with it. That's very difficult. You really need to think really hard. Yeah. You need to be empathetic with the user, really put yourself in their shoes. Imagine the pain points they're going through and let your imagination run wild as to how that can be solved efficiently. So you have to be a mind reader too, not just a product designer or a product manager. And so that's quite hard. But we have a cheat code. Cheat code is you can't talk to users. You don't need just to read their minds. You can actually ask them and figure it out that way. So that's helpful. But I think the one thing that I learned, especially in the early days, when we first started YouMakr, I knew that the one thing that kills the company, the thing that most commonly kills companies, is the founders giving up. But I didn't understand exactly what that meant. I thought giving up on the company is the same thing as giving up on the vision and giving up on the idea. That's not the case. These are two different things. You are meant to give up on your idea if it doesn't work. Don't give up on the company, don't give up on the business, don't give up on the team, but give up on the idea and move to where the user wants to take you, even if it means pivoting and changing the idea and discarding of your entire big vision, which you feel so passionately about. That's fine. Get rid of all of that, but carry on with the business. And I think when I understood the difference between these two, that's when I thought, okay, now I get it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm very curious because you're co-founders. Question for both of you and then individually. Is there an ideal risk profile for founders or entrepreneurs? And then I'm curious whether one of you can be way high on risk profile and the other one can be less conservative, and how you work through that. Or do you have to match your risk profiles to be co-founders?
I think, wow, risk profiles of founders. That's such a great question, John. I've never actually even considered it. Like our journey and, who I am and who Rami is and how we approach risk. I would say in my life up until now, I've been very risk seeking. I don't like to play it safe. Yep. And that's across my life, not just in terms of my entrepreneurial life, but in my professional life, in my academic life, dare I say it, in my romantic life, in my investment life, whatever. I've always, I think treaded on the edge. And sometimes that teeters through into YouMakr. And, Rami and I were having a conversation literally 48 hours ago, just with regards to, spending of certain money on a particular project. And I'm like, let's go. This is it. We're going to go for it. It's going to be amazing. And, I get all emotional. And then Rami's like, hold on a minute. Why don't we think about it from another perspective? And let's just tone down the volume. And I need him to sometimes to settle me. Now, I'm not sure if that's indicative of emotion, but I'm not as cognizant of the risk exposure as he is. And so, further to your question, I think it's important for one part of the duo to be a little bit more, we can do it and let's just go for it. And then the other part to say, actually, let's calm down. If both are too safe, I think that's problematic for the business. And I think if both are too ambitious and kind of gun-ho, I think that also can be a problem for the business. It's important for there to be a bit of a harmony. One's at one end and the other one's at the other end. And the irony of what I'm saying, and it's just hitting me in the head right now, is that I actually come from a risk management background.
Yeah. The reason I ask the question is people think, for instance, that a 10 risk profile is ideal for a startup CEO. And the problem with a 10, and I know because I'm an 11, is it's not that you like more risk. Is when you get to 9 or 10, you simply don't see risk. You see opportunity only, and you don't see risk. And it's dangerous if you don't have somebody. It took me 3 companies to figure out I needed a second in command who could say, pump the brakes. And they were what I would call pragmatists. They would bring things to practical, pragmatic, because I couldn't see the risks of going. Of doubling down or going too fast or spending too much money. My theory was, if we run out of money, we'll get more money. Well, maybe, maybe not. It's not that more risk is better or worse. I'm curious, is there an ideal risk profile for partners or co-founders?
I think it's hard to assess your own risk profile.
It is.
First of all, I would say it's a myth that entrepreneurs love risk. Entrepreneurs don't like risk. Nobody likes risk. In fact, they spend a lot of their money, a lot of their time and money mitigating risk and hedging for it and putting in systems in place to make sure that things don't go wrong. But what I think what we're talking about is there are certain attitudes towards what risk even is. Like you said, it might be that your risk profile is up here, but you don't even see it. You don't even consider it to be something threatening. And you need someone to highlight maybe that, hey, there are issues here, because you're so hyper-focused on the opportunity and the outcome should this work out that you forget about the other dangers if it goes wrong. Now, it reminds me of how I play chess. You know, sometimes when I have a chessboard in front of me, I think like 8, 9, 10 steps ahead, and I get so immersed in my own plan, my own grand scheme, that I start to forget about what the other person is doing. And before I know it, I'm like, checkmate. It's like, what just happened? I was so immersed in my own plan that I just forget to calculate everything else that is going around. So I think there are different attitudes. It's not like we love risk, but we have different approaches to how we deal with it.
Along that line, is it possible to scale a company if the founders aren't scaling themselves? Like, I mean, growing yourselves.
I wasn't expecting these questions, man. Yeah, I think oh my goodness. Like, if I were to look at myself at the beginning of this journey and I were to look at myself now, it's 2 completely different people. Rami oftentimes says to me, like, there is no postgraduate course, whether it's the MBA or the CFA or the ACA or whatever, that will teach you what a startup teaches you.
No way. There's nothing else like it.
Nothing else out there that comes even close. And so I would say that over the years that we've been doing this, there's been a tremendous kind of like personal scaling in terms of our knowledge, our experience, dare I say it, perhaps even our wisdom, but also even like personal characteristics that go over and above that. Just, I would say I'm more patient now than I was when I started this particular process. And I was inherently impatient when I started. And I've learned to accept kind of God's will and be like, okay, like this is the process that we're going on. And sometimes we just have to take a little bit longer, and it happens not necessarily in accordance with your plan. And I think, yeah, I would actually agree with that comment, John, that in order for the business to scale, the founders need to improve and to go on a journey as well. And I think that's why a lot of like exited founders like echo this, that what they say is that it's not the exit, it's not the money that comes at the end, it's the journey that you went on to get to that process. And that's where the value is.
I've done several companies myself, and then now I coach founders and CEOs. And what I tend to see is it's not a universal rule, but the most successful founders are the ones that realize that every small inadequacy or flaw or unresolved issue in you is going to get tested simply because you're selling software or barber shop. It doesn't matter. The system is going to do that. And you can go to MBA school and they've got a safer curriculum that never forces you to do that. And when you run out of money, you have to say, what do I stand for in taking care of my family? And you say, this wasn't, oh, well, we ran out of money. Now what do I do to feed my family? That's a startup or a scaling journey requires every founder to go through that. And you're going to go through it multiple times.
Yeah.
There is nothing like it. But that's why I asked the question, because some people have argued for it. And I appreciate the argument that you can do it and be safer. You're not safe, but you can be safer. And my experience is the least safe you are in that process, the faster you'll grow, because you'll have to take on all of the inadequacies or the cracks in order to get to the next level. And the problem is you won't know what they are. You have no idea what they are until they show up.
And you have to be, as a founder, like receptive to feedback. You can't take it personally. And that's that. I mean, throughout my career, that's been a big problem. Like, somebody gives me something, and I'm like, "Is that a shot? Is that a dig?" Or really? Yeah. And and it requires a level of introspection and humility. And startups have a way of kicking the pride out of you.
Oh yes, there's nowhere to hide. Yeah, there's absolutely
nowhere to hide. And, you have to grind it, and, there's no room for arrogance or pride or boastfulness. It's just at times it can be quite a humiliating endeavor, but you come out the other side, as I say, with that humility and with that personal understanding. And I think that's a good thing. It keeps you grounded. But if you go in hardened, not receptive, then I don't think, and I would argue, actually, there's no point doing it. If you're going to be the same founder you were when you started, what's the point?
Yeah, my experience is you aren't, because now you're a failed founder. You can't go in rigid and think, I got this wired. There's just no, I've not seen it. And maybe it's possible, but that's the business school plan, where you just say, we just go 30% year-on-year growth, and then we go
that's
public.
It's all theoretical, and
I've never seen it. I've just never seen it. So, Last question. What do you, as an organization, or maybe because you guys have very different roles, what do you optimize for? Like in your daily or weekly work or focus, what do you optimize for?
I think, as it relates to my role, so I do four principal jobs. The first is kind of like investor relations. The second is public relations. The third is customer relations. And the fourth is kind of strategic partnerships and new business development. And what we at YouMakr, especially in terms of what I do and what I bring to the table, what we are optimized for is that there is a continuous unending process of new relationships being formed. Constantly, consistently, I'm meeting and talking to, engaging with, and interacting with new people who do different things across the board. And so for us, we are optimized in the sense that we can always leverage upon others as it relates to a particular problem set, or help with satisfying a particular strategy. And that's just part of my personality, like just constantly talking and constantly engaging and constantly interacting. And because of that, our networks grow accordingly across, hypothetically, PR, venture capital, marketing, human resources, or whatever. And that then allows us to solve problems, because ultimately we leverage upon those networks if and when we need to.
That's great. Rami, how about you?
I think we're good at finding clever solutions on a shoestring budget. We find
Was it so bloated that you could call it shoestring? Now I heard it was the ghost of shoestring, or the skeleton of shoestring.
It was like a spider's thread. That's how bad it was. Rami once described us as cockroaches. He's like, Abbas, we are cockroaches in terms of like maintaining our working capital cycle. And it's true, man. We really look after money.
Otherwise, you can't survive for 6 years. We would have been dead long ago. And I think it's a good thing that we were optimized for that from the get-go, because it would allow us so much time to really pivot and figure out everything else we need to figure out. Without that element, we would have been dead before finding the thing.
That's great. It's great. Last question. What should I have asked you about scale that I didn't?
When it comes to scaling, from a personal perspective or from a company perspective?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I would say, like, if you're a founder listening to this particular podcast, when it comes to like fundraising, especially in this environment, there's some key lessons that I've kind of learned with regards to this most recent fundraise. Number one, don't say no ever to any meeting ever, because you could be introduced to X person, and if you go in with a preconceived idea as to that person or how that meeting will go, you're going to significantly curtail your investment opportunity, because sometimes it's from the most obscure, no hope type meetings can actually something beautiful emerge. And so I think that's one kind of question. Like, what is the kind of like, what are the nuances of fundraising? What are the tricks to it, so to speak? The first is just to say yes to every meeting, carte blanche, unending, just speak to everybody. Point one. Point two is that there's no fundraising strategy that, again, you should say no to. So not just any one person, it's also any one strategy, whether it's cold emails, pitch competitions, networking events, leveraging off your LinkedIn, or and anything and everything in between. Say yes, go for it. Because you're fighting with people like Rami and I, and it's, you have to go above and beyond and give yourself as much scope for opportunity as possible. So say yes to every single medium. So that's I think point number two. And I think point number three is, and I think this is really important, and this is a piece of advice that came out of one of the accelerators that we did. It was like, try and be sympathetic to the VC. That when I heard that, and I didn't quite understand it, but I really understand it now, because you can get rejected and you can take it personally. But you have to realize, if you can be sympathetic to the VC, you can put yourself in their shoes. They see hundreds of opportunities daily, and they have to basically foresee what the market is going to look like, what that team is going to look like, what that product is going to look like in 5, 7, 10 years' time. And they have to be borderline psychic. It's an impossible job. And I think if you can be sympathetic to the process, your likelihood of achieving success in that process is higher, because you're now 1 degree removed from the emotion of it. You're now a lot more pragmatic about that process, and you're more receptive to the feedback that VCs give you. And I think that's an important mindset to have when you go into the process.
Rami, how about you? What questions should I have asked you about scale that I didn't?
I think business model might be an important area. I think the piece of insight I can share there from our experience is we discovered there's a difference between a user and a customer. The user isn't always the customer. And so we were so focused on getting users, but not necessarily paying customers. Because we figured out that actually the people that are enjoying our product aren't the people who are meant to pay for it, but there should be something else. And there are multiple ways that can take effect. Like, for example, if you're building toys, you need to sell to the parents, not to the kids, even though the kid is the user. Students fall into that category. If your business model rely on B2B2C, for example, you need to start thinking about a strategy to appeal to partners who then sell to the user. And so that needs to be factored in as opposed to the end user in particular.
No, that's great. It's very, very interesting distinction, users versus customers. So you listen to them differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And they have different needs, and you need to be able to play both sides.
Yeah. That's it's very interesting, especially for product market fit. It makes a huge difference.
Massive.
Yeah.
Massive.
Abbas, Rami, thank you so much for appearing on Genius at Scale. For our regular listeners, thank you as well. And we look forward to seeing you on our next episode. All the best. Thanks for joining us today. Are you ready to scale? If so, invest 3 minutes in our Scalability Index. It's simple, easy, and gives specific guidance. Find it at evokinggenius.com/scale. All the best.